Well, it's wonderful to be with you all again this morning. I want to thank Gina for preaching last week. I think she did a wonderful job. And last week, my family and I, we all had head colds. And so we were worshiping on our couches with you all via YouTube. What a wonderful morning of worship we've already had on this World Communion Sunday. This is an especially meaningful worship service for me. My mother and mother-in-law are here. They have come on this World Communion Sunday from the land of Missouri. And if Missourians brought bread to this table, I think it would be Lambert's Throwed Rolls is probably what we would contribute. So I'm delighted to have them with us. And by the way, some people I told that to said, "You mean your mother and mother-in-law traveled together from Missouri?" And they love each other. May your family be as blessed as ours. Pray with me. Prepare our hearts, O Lord, to accept your word. Silence in us any voice but your own, so that we may hear your word and obey your will. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, one of my favorite TV shows that I'm watching right now is called Ted Lasso. It's a show about an American football coach who gets hired as the head coach of a failing British soccer team. But Ted Lasso is not actually a show about sports. It's actually a show about relationships and emotions. When Coach Ted Lasso arrives in Europe, he openly admits he knows nothing about soccer. On the plane ride over to England, he asked his assistant coach, "Explain to me again why they tie so often." See, he becomes a beloved coach, but not because he's brilliant and not because he wins a bunch of games, but Ted is just an all-around good guy. He's nice, and he's kind, and he's humble. And Ted is willing to admit that he doesn't know what he's doing. And in the world of professional sports, that is so rare that the country ends up loving him for it. See, the show Ted Lasso is so compelling because it shows you what it looks like for someone who is kind and decent and humble to be in leadership. Ted is somebody who is willing to embrace his limits. We don't like to embrace the limits in our lives, do we? If we don't know something, oftentimes we just pretend like we do. And most of the time, we see limits on who we are as challenges to overcome. But what would it look like for us to instead accept and maybe even, yes, embrace the limits in our lives? Well, this morning we are continuing our series through emotionally healthy spirituality. And so far we have seen how we discover who we truly are in Jesus Christ. We have seen how we must re-examine our past in light of God's grand story. And last week we talked about how God is with us even in the midst of our valleys and as we journey through the wall in our faith. And this morning we are talking about our limits. We don't like to focus on our limits, and mostly I think this is because our limits are really forms of loss. And we are a people familiar with loss. We lose our youthfulness and our health, and there is no amount of plastic surgery or cosmetics or diet or exercise that can reverse aging. And if somebody tells you that it can, they are trying to take your money. Many of us have experienced moments where we've lost things precious to us suddenly. A family member dies, a spouse has an affair, we receive a certain diagnosis, we lose our jobs, we feel betrayed by people that we love. Many of us eventually lose some of the ideas that we've always held about God and the church. Maybe our simple black and white ideas about God turned out to be unhelpful. That's a kind of loss and a kind of grief. Maybe you've been part of a church in the past that has turned out to be unhealthy or toxic. And so we lose that community in our lives. And certainly in the past year and a half, we have been dealing with loss and limits. Some of us have literally lost family members to this pandemic. And all of us have found limits placed on our lives, like masks and vaccines. And let's be honest, some people have been much more emotionally healthy about such things than others. We all have limits on our lives. Embracing those limits on our lives is really about admitting those losses, something that does not come easily to people like us. And our guide in learning to embrace our loss, embrace our limits, is the book of Job. But in order to understand the passage that Lori has read for us from Job, I need to take you on a tour through the entire story of Job. Job is actually one of those very difficult books to preach on because you can't take just one passage in Job. You got to have the whole view of what's going on. And so we're going to have a bird's eye view of the story of the book of Job. It's likely, by the way, one of the earliest stories in human history. In fact, almost all cultures have a story of someone who is good and righteous who loses everything they have and how they respond to it. The first thing that we learn about Job in the book of Job is that Job the man is righteous and successful. We read that he has 10 sons and daughters. He has 7,000 sheep, 500 oxen, 500 donkeys, and lots of servants. This is a man who has achieved great things in his life. And one day, Satan goes to God and says, you know, the only reason Job is righteous is because his life is so cushy. If you take away all this stuff, he'll curse you. He'll fold like a cheap card table. So Job loses all his property, and his sons and daughters are killed in a tornado. And suddenly he develops all over his body painful boils. He loses his wealth, he loses his family, he loses his health in an instant, but still Job does not curse God's name. And at the end of chapter 2 of the book of Job, it ends with this pious line, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And that is how most of us read the book of Job. It's a book about a man who has patient endurance in the face of suffering. But that's not actually the book of Job. Because if we move right from chapter 2 to chapter 3, the tone changes on a dime. Job looks up at the sky and he says, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job said, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived, let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it." Now, this is not exactly the pious Job of patient endurance. This is a man who is lamenting his circumstances, is crying out in the midst of his pain and his loss and his limits. This is a man desperate to understand why. Why is any of this happening to me? And then Job also has some friends who come to help him. His friends come to him and they say things like, well, this must be because of some sin in your life. Or they say, "Woo, how dare you speak that way about God?" At one point, one of his friends even says, "You know, your children must have been pretty evil for God to kill them like that." Job's friends engage in the age-old game of denial and avoidance and rationalization. They deny that Job was truly righteous. They try to rationalize. There must be some reason why this is happening. They cannot accept that sometimes bad things just happen. In 1861, Queen Victoria of England lost her husband Albert to typhoid fever. Queen Victoria was so distraught by this loss that she demanded that nothing change in the palace. For years, she slept with Albert's nightshirt in her arms. She made his bedroom into a sacred room to be kept exactly as it was when he was alive. And every day for the rest of her long life, she demanded that the servants in the palace change the linens on his empty bed that they lay out fresh clothes for her dead husband every morning, and that they even prepare water for his shave. And attached to her bed was a photograph of Albert lying in his casket. Like Job's friends, Queen Victoria tried to deny this loss in her life. And most of us are not going to we're not going to go to those kind of lengths to avoid loss and limits, but we do engage in other things in order to numb us away from feeling the loss and the limits in our lives. Maybe we watch television incessantly. For example, the abomination that is 24/7 news. We numb ourselves into thinking that we're so informed about the way of the world, but we don't know the names of our neighbors. We numb ourselves through busyness, running from one activity to another, working 70 hours a week, signing the kids up for so many activities that we no longer spend quality time together as a family. We sleep with our smartphones next to our beds and allow its fake light to steal minute after minute of our lives, all in the pursuit of the small dopamine hit we receive that it's designed to give us anyway. We indulge in overeating, drinking, pornography, social media, shopping. We engage in all kinds of activities to numb us from feeling any sense of loss or any limits on our lives. But Job refuses to be numbed. Job refuses to avoid, to rationalize, to ignore what he is feeling. He demands an audience with God. He wants to know why. He wants to know why God would allow all of these awful things to happen to him. So then, in chapter 38 of Job, God responds. God responds out of the whirlwind. Job wants to know why all of this has happened to him, and God responds by taking Job on a grand tour through all of creation. God says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? Where were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" God speaks to Job about all of the magnificent processes in creation and of the mysterious creatures of the deep. Now, why is God doing this? Well, sometimes people read God's words to Job here as if God is chastising Job, as if God is offended by Job's challenge, as if God is angry with Job. But that's not what is happening here. God is taking Job through a tour of creation so that Job will understand his place in the universe. Job has demanded that God give him an answer, yet Job's life is one tiny, small part in a grand cosmos. God is saying to Job, your perspective is so limited. You only see a tiny fraction of what I see. And sometimes we long to try to understand things that are quite honestly not understandable. A lady once wrote to C.S. Lewis saying, I have a hard time conceptualizing heaven, thinking of heaven, imagining what that would be like. And what I do know, it honestly sounds kind of boring. I'm not sure I want to go there. Lewis wrote back to her and he said, well, there was once a little boy who had a lollipop in his mouth. And he was thinking about some things that he'd overheard at school. And he went to his mother and he asked his mother, Mama, what is kissing? And his mama said, well, that's when two people who love each other, they put their mouths together. And he thought about that for a minute, and he looked at his lollipop, and he said, can you have a lollipop in your mouth when you're kissing? And she said, no. And he said, well, then I don't ever want to kiss anybody. Embracing our limits, sisters and brothers, is about accepting that we will ultimately not have all our questions answered. We will ultimately not know all of the mysteries of the universe, and that not everything has to happen for a reason. At least not a reason that it's our part to ever know. After speaking to God about all of the mysteries and the majesty of creation, Job responds to God in chapter 40 and says, "See, I am of small account to you. What answer shall I give to you? I lay my hand upon my mouth." Job comes face to face with the omniscience, the all-knowing nature of God, and Job has realized that God's plans far exceed his ability to comprehend. Job embraces his limits. And somehow, that's exactly the answer that Job needed. He needed to know and trust in the vastness of God, even in the midst of his struggle and loss. I read a story recently about a mother whose teenage son had been killed in a car accident. And on the morning of his funeral, she woke up early, she reached for her Bible, and she turned to the speeches of God from the end of the book of Job. She told a loved one this, and the loved one said, Why would you turn there? She said this, "I needed to know that my pain was not all there is in the world." What she needed, what Job needed, what we need, is the reassurance of a God whose power of creation and recreation is stronger than the powers of chaos and death and loss and limits we experience in our lives. Emotionally healthy spirituality is about accepting and, yes, even embracing our limits before an almighty Creator. But emotionally healthy spirituality also recognizes that there is a God who is big enough and loving enough to hear our questions, to hear our frustrations, to hear our confusion. Notice what happens at the end of the book of Job in the passage Lori read. Job has spent 42 chapters complaining about God's treatment of him, and his friends keep coming to God's defense with good, pat Sunday school answers. Yet what does God say to them at the end? God turns to Job's friends and say, "My wrath is kindled against you, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." They're the ones who have been defending God. Job has been lamenting. Job has been complaining. And yet God says at the end, Job is the one who speaks rightly. Why? Because Job is honest. At the end of the book of Job, God isn't angry at Job for questioning the justice of the universe. God is angry with Job's friends who tried to come up with easy and pat answers for life's great mysteries. Kate Bowler is a professor of Christian history at Duke Divinity School. A few years ago, she says that everything was going well in her life. She was 35, she was married to her high school sweetheart, she had a newborn son, and she had just started working at Duke University. I know that's offensive to some of you. But then she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And she suddenly found herself wrestling with her own mortality, her own finiteness, her own limitations. A few years ago, she wrote a beautiful, funny, and wise book about this experience with just a great title, "Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved." In the book, she reflects on how her faith changed when she was faced with real suffering in her life. She says that in the face of her suffering, she realized that she had been subscribing to a kind of prosperity gospel view of God. She had bought into the idea that she could control the shape of her life with enough American grit and determination. But eventually, she had to learn to let go. And she writes this, "What would it mean for Christians to give up that little piece of the American dream that says, you are limitless, you can do anything? Everything is not possible, and you cannot do everything. The mighty kingdom of God is not yet here. And what if rich did not have to mean wealthy and whole did not have to mean healed? What if being people of the gospel meant that we are simply people with good news? The good news that God is here, that we are loved, and that is enough. Embrace your limits. Now, one quick sidebar I feel like I need to offer here. When I say embrace your limits, I do not mean that our job is just to accept whatever station we have in life and be fine with it. The gospel cannot say to the marginalized and the oppressed in our world, well, just accept who you are in life. That is not good news. I am not talking about embracing the injustice and the intolerance and the prejudice that exist in our world. I am talking about those limits that we cannot do anything about, but yet we fight nonetheless. And our culture continues to feed to us the myth that we can do and we can be anything we want to be. If you ask many people their favorite verse in the Bible, I bet at least half will say Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's a word from the Apostle Paul, and people love it because I think the way they tend to interpret it is, oh yeah, I can do anything I want to do as long as it's stamped with Jesus. The problem is that in the context, that verse means the exact opposite. Here's the context. I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little. I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Paul writes this letter from prison, and he's saying he has found the secret of contentment. The secret of contentment is recognizing that Christ is with him in any and all circumstances, when he is free and when he is in prison, when he is poor and when he is rich, when he is successful and when he is a failure. In any circumstance, Christ is with him. And it is because of that that Paul can endure all things. I don't know what kind of loss and limitation you carry in your life. Maybe it's the limitations of broken relationships that you desperately wish to heal. Maybe you are limited by your own body and you can no longer do what you used to do. Maybe you are limited by what others in society say about you. I don't know how you are limited, but is it possible that if you were to take your limitations and set them up against the vastness of God's creation, that there's a strange kind of comfort that can come even from embracing our limits? Because while we may never get all the answers to all of our questions, we do believe in a good God who is always with us, a God whose creation reminds us that our limits, our loss, and our pain is not all there is in the world. And maybe that's enough. But the truth is, it's more than enough. Thanks be to God.